Kane rode with his heavy sword strapped to his saddle, in easy reach. Evangolis had laughed at this. "We're on a hunting party, Wanderer, not a war party." Kane hadn't cared for the albino's jibe, but remembering that minstrels and jesters were expected to be impertinent, he had only shrugged. "A man of my profession finds his sword a lifelong companion. And a true colleague, no doubt," Evangolis laughed. "I think it's rather an extension of your brawny arm, and you can't leave it behind. But your profession, what exactly is that?" "Death," answered Kane.
Hail fellow travelers, Tim from Secret Fire Books here with a book review. This time I'm reviewing Death Angel's Shadow by Carl Edward Wagner. This is a short story collection that collects 3 of his short stories featuring the character Kane the Mystic Swordsman. Now the thing is, ever since I started my YouTube channel back in late 2023, ever since I put up that first book review of Conan and the Siege of the Black Citadel, I have been getting the same comment over and over and over again. "Tim, have you read Kane by Carl Edward Wagner?" And every time I have to answer the same way. No, I've not read Kane by Carl Edward Wagner. Those books are out of print, they're really hard to come by, and when you do find them, they are going for ridiculous prices. Not nearly as ridiculous as Trail of Bohu by Charles Saunders, but still pretty ridiculous prices. So unfortunately, I had never had the chance to read any of the Kane stories. But thankfully, Michael K. Vaughan, who is quickly ingratiating himself as one of my favorite people of all time, was nice enough to send me this copy of Death Angel's Shadow, as well as a copy of one of the Kane novels, Bloodstone. And so I read this, I finished it, and now I have to answer the burning question. Is it worth the hype? Is Kane by Carl Edward Wagner as good as everyone says it is? Short answer, yeah, pretty much. Kane is an eternal vagabond, an immortal warrior who wields his bloody sword in his own self-interest and leaves a swath of death and destruction wherever he goes. He is cursed to wander the realms of mankind for all eternity, never knowing the taste of death unless it should arise from the violence that he himself creates. He is a towering giant of a man with flaming red hair, the cold blue eyes of a killer, and the strength of a monster. It is heavily implied that he is the actual biblical Cain, the son of Adam, the first murderer who slew his brother Abel and was marked by God himself, so that, should he ever die, he would be avenged sevenfold. No, not like them! He's also a very interesting character to focus on as the protagonist of a series of fantasy stories. Kane is our protagonist, but he is definitely not a hero. I wouldn't even say that he's an anti-hero. That implies that he has some kind of ethical code or some kind of guilty conscience. Kane doesn't have any of those things. He is a bad guy. He's done some horrible things in the many, many years that he's been alive. He's committed murder. He's taken part in human sacrifice. He's dabbled in the dark arts. He's led armies of monsters and ruled over kingdoms as an iron-fisted tyrant, only to abandon his throne and seek whatever whimsy suits him next. But that's just the thing. This isn't Conan, who has this savage sense of honor and dignity. This isn't Elric, who, even though he's a demon worshiper, is still loyal to those he loves. This is a character made for an extremely grim, drippy, gothic fantasy world, and that really is the best part of these Kane stories. The world that Carl Edward Wagner sets up isn't necessarily super detailed like the Hyborian Age or any other sword and sorcery universe, but the atmosphere is just so effective. It is so pungently dark and oppressive. At the expense of losing anyone who isn't a gamer, reading Carl Edward Wagner's prose is like reading something out of a FromSoft game. You know how when you're playing Elden Ring and you enter Caelid for the first time?
Well, will you look at this place?
Beware all ye who enter.
That's what reading Carl Edward Wagner's prose feels like. Everything is just so creepy and oppressive, and you just feel, yeah. While his contemporaries were inspired by 20th century action-adventure fiction, stuff by Edgar Rice Burroughs and Robert E. Howard, Carl Edward Wagner was more inspired by the gothic horror stories of the 19th century. So while you have people like Fritz Leiber and Gardner Fox writing barbarian stories that are a lot like Conan, you have Carl Edward Wagner, who's writing barbarian stories inspired by Edgar Allan Poe and Bram Stoker. It's some really interesting stuff, and some people would say that it's not really even sword and sorcery. I don't know if I agree with that, but we can split hairs all day. All I know is that this stuff is good. It's dark, it's brutal, and it's really good. The thing is, I'm getting really sick and tired of the whole grimdark fantasy subgenre. There's nothing I hate more than when all the dude bros here on booktube walk around like, oh, if you read the First Law trilogy, Joe Abercrombie just gets it, man. His stuff is brutal. Look, I've read the First Law trilogy. There's nothing that really impressed me about that series. At no time was I ever like, oh wow, that's really, really brutal, or that's really messed up. But there were times when I was reading Death Angel's Shadow where I was just squirming on the inside. When I finished the first short story, I needed to go take a walk. I was so spooked. So it's really, really effective stuff. And if you like the kind of grimdark fantasy that's just pumped out ad nauseum nowadays, you owe it to yourself to check out some of the older stuff. I know it's hard to come by these Carl Edward Wagner books, but his writing is just so spot on when it comes to the grit and the brutality and, like I said, the gothic atmosphere of dark fantasy. There are 3 short stories in this fix-up. The first of them is Reflections for the Winter of My Soul, and it starts off with the servant of a wealthy baron lying on the floor, bleeding to death after having a chunk of his throat torn out. And while this poor man is gasping his final breaths, he suddenly sits bolt upright and proclaims, "Death! Death has come! Death in the form of a man!" And then with one last gory splurt, he expires, bleeding all over his friends and loved ones.
So brutal start. Brutal start to the monster from the thing. And what's the is this called?
From that point on, the story focuses on the Baron and his family as they hunker down for a particularly harsh winter in their castle. And the next day, none other but Kane shows up on their doorstep, passed out and half frozen. The Baron takes Kane in, nurses him back to health, and for his part, Kane does repay the Baron by rescuing his daughter's life during a disastrous hunting expedition. However, the next day, more people are murdered. More of the Baron's men show up with their throats gouged out, and the only one of them who's just barely hanging on to life mentions something about a werewolf being in the castle, and then he dies. And so now we have this literal game of werewolf going on, where we have a bunch of suspects. We have Kane, we have the Baron himself, we have the Baron's kind of shy, soft-spoken daughter, we have the Baron's son who is crazy and possibly possessed by a demon, we have the son's personal physician who is also a wizard, we have this smarmy, wisecracking bard, and we have a whole host of guardsmen who are super nervous because they just know that they're going to be the next ones who get their throats torn out. I will say that even though I guessed who the werewolf was, who the murderer was at the very beginning of this story, Carl Edward Wagner did do a really good job of building up the tension, building up the mystery, and introducing enough red herrings to throw us off. I think I just got pretty lucky in who I guessed. The second story is Cold Light, in which Kane finds this dusty little village, or town, I guess, that has recently experienced a plague. Most of the people there have died out, and the ones that are still living are kind of just limping on in this really decadent, stagnant existence. They really don't care about anything that's going on in the outside world. They just want to be left alone. And so they're fine if Kane just decides to crash in one of the deserted houses on the edge of this town. Unfortunately, Kane is also followed by Gatha the Avenger, this high-rolling, holier-than-thou crusader type who has made it his goal in life to exterminate evil wherever he finds it, a la Solomon Kane. And now he has set his sights on Kane. And so this town becomes a battlefield, with the battle being between Kane, a literal immortal warrior, and Gatha and his 9 crusaders. And so we get this kind of strange dynamic where we see this crusader, Gatha, as almost this anti-hero type. You see where he's coming from. You realize that the world would be better if Kane were dead, but Gatha and his men are fanatics. They are absolute psychos. They say that they're all in it for the greater good, but they will stoop to any low to get their job done. They will torture. They will kill. They will do other R-rated things in order to accomplish their goals. And so you're left thinking, who's the real monster? Kane or these crusaders? And finally, the last story is Mirage, in which Kane, after stumbling away from a bloody battlefield, finds his way through this dark forest crawling with flesh-eating ghouls, and eventually makes it to what he thinks is a ruined castle. He then passes out and wakes up and finds that the castle is actually not as ruined as he suspected, and it's actually tenanted by this mysterious woman and all of her servants. And I won't go too much further into that because this story is really, really short, and to say any more would spoil the whole, basically everything. This story is definitely my least favorite of the 3. It's not bad by any means. It's just, it doesn't have as much substance as the other 2 have. That said, it did have a ton of atmosphere. The scenes of Kane limping his way through the dark forest and kind of hallucinating as he's going, those were amazing. Once again, Karl Edward Wagner's descriptive prose was just so effectively gloomy. I loved it. But I do have one big problem with this book. I'm not going to harp on any of my nitpicks. There's plenty of those, but I'm not going to talk about them because they really don't matter in the grand scheme of things. But there is one thing that really dragged me out of my immersion every time I opened up this book, and that is the fact that Karl Edward Wagner cannot write character dialogue to save his life. Oh gosh, is that speaking ill of the dead? Oh man, I feel bad now. But it's true, he can't. At the very least, he can't write character dialogue that fits with this gothic, pseudo-medieval fantasy world that he's writing. He'll go from some beautifully written prose about some gothic castle with this foggy cemetery surrounding it and how it makes the characters feel, the impression it makes upon them. And then a character will open his mouth and say something like, "Hey guys, there's a werewolf in our castle." It's not that bad, but it's pretty bad. It feels like every time Karl Edward Wagner had to write dialogue, he turned the writing duties over to some 13-year-old kid. There is some Brandon Sanderson level dialogue in this book.
Are you trying to hurt my feelings? Because if so, you are succeeding. Fortunately, my feelings regenerate at twice the speed of a normal man's.
But all that aside, I still really enjoyed Death Angel's Shadow. I enjoyed Karl Edward Wagner's amazing prose. It's absolutely phenomenal. It still deserves to be read, and it's really unfortunate that these books have gone out of print. So I will say, if you stumble upon one of these in the wild, as improbable as that would be, buy it. Buy it immediately, because it is good stuff. But that's all for now, guys. Let me know in the comments, have you read Death Angel's Shadow or any of Karl Edward Wagner's other books? Let me know what you thought of them. And until next time, guys, as always, farewell and keep reading.
That was brutal.